Hi, my name's John, and I'm here to talk about why we need to abolish the police. You might be thinking, why would anyone want to abolish the police? Don't they like keep us safe? As a black person, they never can keep us safe, right? The way that people occur, the way racialized people, working class people are treated is very different than the way rich upper middle class are treated. You know, they're there to keep us safe. Why? Why did these bicycles exist? Well, the police haven't always existed. They're a very recent invention. Um, so why not consider the history of British policing? Right? Why were you guys made in the first place? Right? Um, like everything with British history, um, the story starts with slavery. Right? Slavery. Right? So the structure, right? The British slave trade. Um, so the Brits would go over to Africa, take slaves, move them over to the Caribbean and America, and then take the more materials from that slave back to England and selling this others and whatnot, right? And profit. Um, and so what you have, right, is the ruling class of England, right? These lords, um, the royalty, right? They're the ones that are profiting from all this looting. The first slaving mission in England in 1562. John Hawkins went to Guinea, stole 300 slaves, and traded them for pearls and sugar and whatnot. Right, and he got direct support from Queen Elizabeth, and like you know that was celebrated. And so the British ruling class, they grew their wealth massively, from selling slaves or selling the products of slave trade, right? So selling the products of the slave plantation. Um, and so the slave trade grew massively, establishing the Royal African Company, all right, which formalized the trade. And yeah, at the same time, um, in British towns, right, police, I think, yeah, law and order was kind of just based on like everyone just working together, right? If someone stole from you, you'd be like, "Hey, there's a thief," and everyone would just like catch the thief and like this thing or whatever. Um, and because this was somewhat fair, fluid, like Islamics, people had like a sense of like mutual obligation, right? As opposed to the rigid, like feudal serfdom in the countryside, right? And so like this supposedly works, right? People just kind of had the obligation to look after each other, right? There wasn't really need for police in these times. Right? So, anyways, slave trade goes on and it gets crazier and crazier and crazier, right? Britain, you know, ends up, like, eight or like by the 1760s, like over 80,000 Africans being like transported a year, and Britain, like half of their ships are British ships, right? Like Britain's like prolific in ship. So what has it got to do with policing? Is this goes on in the year 1800? There were two acts of parliament that created the first publicly funded police forces. one in Glasgow and one in London. And both of these were key areas where ports for the slave trade were, right? Glasgow, for example, was a direct route to North America, Caribbean, right? And so, right, the ruling class of Britain were benefiting from the slave trade, right? So you have people like Patrick Colquhoun who convinced the merchants and committees of slaves and whatnot to fund like a private police force. Right? Because these new class they're raking in all this dough from selling slaves and the products of slave labor, but they're losing money because their shit's being stolen. So they work together and say, you know what, let's fund the private police force to patrol the area. Right? And so this police force was explicitly set up by colonizers and slave owners to defend their colonial property. Right? Which again, a lot of property laws and whatnot were created for this colonialism. It's like, do you really own that shit? But anyways, right? But yeah, the people that were stealing all the loot, is it really stuff? Right, where are they coming from? Where are they coming from? Again, you gotta go back to more clearly. So, if you go back, 1757, the British East India Company, had set to the south in Bengal, right? And they managed to, plunder treasure and bring that back to London. And later on they would install a puppet leader and expand across all of India. Again, colonialism. But what's key here though is the massive wealth that was taken from this colonialism is what led to the Industrial Revolution, right? So inventions after 1757, like the steam engine and the spinning jenny, right? All of it, both in which in 1760s, they managed to get to a time manufacturing spread across the country. Whilst inventions prior to that, like the wired roller spinning machine, never took off, right? Because they just didn't have that capital to support and invest in. Right? So what's one thing that we always seem to forget is the Industrial Revolution would not have happened if it wasn't for the massive amounts of wealth that was plundered from colonialism. Right? And so with this wealth, with all this, industrialization and machinery, factories were built across the country. But I say, factories require workers to run them, right? And where are you gonna get workers from? The countryside. Right? So in medieval England, there were lots of open fields, right, and systems that we used to grow crops. The lords, right, the green class, would come to these fields, these public common fields, and start, fencing up land, being like, hey, that's mine. I want to use it for sheep pasture. You can't make corn, right? Because this is much worse. And that led to a bunch of rebellions, under the peasant rebellion, right? Over all of the centuries. It's keep stealing land from the people. People get mad and they revolt, right? And this goes on and on and on and on, right? But by 1750s, by the time we're talking, they took it to the max, right? I think over like a more than 100-year period, 7 million acres of land were changed, right? By 4,000 acts of parliament, and this dispossessed a lot of people. It's like you have no land, you can't no farms, nothing to like. You have nothing like you need to live, and so they moved to moved to the towns for work, right? So by 1800, 80% of the population live in London, right? And you see this process still going on today. Okay. So yeah, so this dispossessed, rural, poor, right, end up forming the vast majority of the the new working class in the towns, and the labor conditions are terrible. The wages are low. You've got child labor, right? Children working machines. There was poor safety, right? People are dying. The work days were 14, 16 hours. There was no holidays. It sucked. It really sucked, right? People aren't just gonna sit there and let you exploit them. I mean, maybe today we will, but this is part of the reason, right? So people they revolted. They would have there's one unionizing and organizing, bigger strikes. And the government response to this is not to listen, it's to how do you make striking illegal, right? It's to punish them. Right? And I think at the time, only 3% of the total population actually could vote. That was just the men who owned land. Yeah. So like protesters were like, yo, like it's the right to vote. It should be like all men, not women, because we didn't have feminism yet. We didn't have intersectionality yet. But they're like, or if we let everyone vote, then it's be fair. We can use the public money, you know, more equally, better taxes and blah blah. Just kind of like democracy. But again, it's people getting more protesting, getting mad. Uh, so like it's like tens of thousands of people, like demonstrations and whatnot. So the government's like, we gotta send in the army because that's what we do. So, right, the soldiers are like, you either listen, let them demonstrate, or attack. And yeah, in Manchester in 1819, or, we attacked a crowd of 10,000 people, 50 people were killed, 700 people were injured. It was a huge backlash, right? And yeah, so response the government just criminalized protesting, right? Introducing laws like the Seditious Meetings Prevention Act, which basically prevented meetings of more than 50 people, right? And the thing is, um, the government had already experimented with how to quell resistance in their colonies across the world, right? Just nearby, there's Ireland, right? Ireland, which was a British colony, right? This is before Irish people became white, right? Before they sold their souls to the devil of whiteness, the devil of racism, and got accepted into whiteness. Yeah, so there were many Irish rebellions, and was it inspired by like the American Revolution? They were like, yeah, that's right up. And also like the French Revolution, and the British responded with martial law, burning homes, torturing captives, murdering people, and whatnot. And yeah, the Irish Parliament got dissolved because in 1800s because they couldn't be trusted. Yeah, and so who's in charge of this? Robert Peel, who was the Chief Secretary of Ireland at the time, established the Peace Preservation Act in order to maintain control. Right, he set up the Irish Constabulary in 1822. And they influenced the colonial police forces in Canada, Australia, North America, whatnot. Right. By 1828, Robert Peel became Home Secretary of the UK, right? And he set up the London Met in 1829, right? And bringing with that many of the practices that were tried and tested in Ireland, right? But obviously, right, they had to change the vibes up a bit, because there was backlash from the Peter Lewis. So they wouldn't just have the straight up military instead of army. Right, that changed the vibes, change the vibes. The army, with that red coat and the big hats and guns. So like blue coat, tall hat and a little trench. Bam 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 bam. It's the same job, but the vibes, right? And it's also like it's got to be working class people. He said that the police work should be performed by working class men, supervised by working class men, right? This is not too dissimilar, or what's going on right now, where America is getting Kenya to send Kenyan police to Haiti because they're like, if they're being supervised by black police officers, there might be. It's the same kind of vibes, kind of trying to use their control of each other. But don't let me diverge too much. But anyways, so what do these cops do? These peelers? Well, their job is to apprehend all loose, idle, and disorderly persons whom he shall find disturbing the public peace, or whom he shall have just cause to suspect any evil designs, and all persons whom he shall find between the sunset and 8 in the forenoon, lying in any highway, yard, or other place, or loitering therein, and not giving a satisfactory account of themselves. Right. So it's just surveillance, right? And it's just talking to people day life, just like you're hanging out with your friends, being watched by some dumbass in a hut, right? If you have different like politics or religion, it's just really people's day-to-day lives, right? But it also got a police force that was used to everyday violence, right? Again, even though they got their little truncheons, which is supposed to be non-lethal, but sometimes people are killed. People get killed as a result of this violence. And when you're doing this every day to day, you get used to the idea of like, oh, hey, policing kills sometimes. It's just part of the job. That's part of the job. So when you're being ordered to crush a rebellion and you have to use violence, well, you're used to it. That's just part of the job. That's just part of the job, because like they're used to it. In which the army wasn't, because right. So yeah, putting it all together, right? The first tax-funded professional police forces in Britain were set up to protect colonial wealth from theft. Many of those stealing was a huge influx of dispossessed country people who had to move to find work after being, forced off their own land, right? The equipment in these factories were made viable because of wealth that was expropriated from colonies and slave labor. The working and living conditions were terrible for the people, so therefore they tried to organize social change. The government came up with new ways to prevent this change because sending in the army wasn't working. The policing practices that they used for repressing these social movements were tested on colonial subjects first and then brought to London, right? And it's based on all this that the London Met was established in 1829, right? So that is to say, the Metropolitan Police have violence, racism, capitalist exploitation, and repression of social movements built into their foundations, right? That is the whole reason they exist, right? So when it comes to talking about the police and do they keep us safe, right, we have to make this distinction between the actual function that the police have in society and this common myth that we're told of keeping us safe, right? Because 97% of sex offenders get away with it in the UK, right? Sexual assault only became a crime like recently, like in the 1970s, right? Most violent crimes go unsolved. Even when they are solved, it's not necessarily the right person, right? Since the 1990s, over 1,700 people have been killed in police custody, right? And none of them, I think maybe one of them, have gotten any sort of like justice, right? And so, how do you interpret these statistics? If you buy into the commonly told myth of the head keep it safe, then like that's just part of their job, right? But if you take in the historical context, right? See, the real reason is, well, actually, they're good at their job. Their job was never to keep us safe in the first place. Their job was to control the working class, to stop uprisings, and they're good at that, right? They're a squad of violence workers that uphold the rules of the 1%. They've got violence and racism baked into their practices. In the almost 200 years that they've existed, the tools and techniques they've developed and perfected over the years were never made for stopping sexual assault, or keeping us safe. That's why they're really ineffective at these things. That's why you still have knife crime like that, right? Like their tools were never made to deal with these issues. They were invented to stop uprisings, right? Um, that's why I think we should exist, right? Because when you buy into, right, this myth that they're here to protect us, right? A myth that has only recently, you know, like since like 1950s, 60s, 70s, been a thing because of the media. Right? Almost every movie, uh, they are told by the police they can't portray the police in a negative light. Like their movies have literal propaganda in them. Right? I love Brooklyn Nine-Nine; it's a great show, but a lot of shows it's just propaganda where they portray the police as, a force that's like keeping us safe, right? But again, in reality, that's just not their job. And so a lot of liberals, right, will see, okay, the harm that police do, right, but still believe in their role and will suggest reforms to try and fix it. Right? Things like body cameras or more training, or what if we have community policing, right? Or what if we just have like a board that oversees them, right? But the thing is, when you give cops body cameras, you are increasing the funding to police, right? You are not challenging the false idea that police keep us safe, and you are providing them with more tools and tactics and technology. You are not reducing the scale of policing, right? What we see is, because the police have control over their body cams, they choose when to turn it on and off. They choose when to share their footage, right? They've been found to doctor footage. They've been found to plant evidence, right? And record the footage in a way that falsely incriminates innocent people. Like because we're not actually challenging the idea of them keeping it safe, we're actually giving them tools to further do their job, because their job was never about keeping it safe, right? Police, they lie all the time. But pretty much what most cops do is lie, because they know that they have an authority and you're probably going to believe them. They lie, it makes you up. It's about you know control. It's never been about keeping people safe, right? um, and like things like more training, right? Again, that's giving them more funding. It doesn't challenge this idea, because you're like, oh well, they keep us safe, but they just need to do it in the right way. Let's give them more training, um, which again is giving them more tools and more tactics, right? And what's even sadder is, so sometimes people will be like, you know what? Let's give them training on how to respond to mental health situations, which sounds like a good thing, but remember, police, their job isn't to keep us safe. They are trained to see everyone as a potential threat, because they need to be able to use violence to control us. And so this leads to these terrible situations where now police are being used for all these situations where they're not really meant to. There's a mental health crisis, you call 911, you call 999, the police, they come and, blam someone up, arrest somebody, when that's the wrong worker for the job, right? So, and so, like, just adding these reform after reform after reform, it's a pointless uphill battle that's hurting people and killing people, right? Police was never intended to keep us safe. If we truly want to combat violence and harm, we must immediately abolish the police and replace them with effective alternatives that are designed for our safety from the get go.